I'm recording. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our BATS Superheroes of the Night. We're going to give it just a couple minutes and we'll get started shortly. All right, hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Friends of Dyke-Marsh member meeting. Topic is BATS Superheroes of the Night. Before we get started, just wanted to go over some housekeeping and Zoom etiquette. So throughout the presentation, please keep your microphones on mute and your cameras turned off. This will help with bandwidth throughout the presentation. We also ask that if you have any comments or questions throughout the presentation tonight, to please leverage the chat box, and we will review any comments and questions during a Q&A period at the end of the presentation. During that time, we also welcome anybody to speak up to provide any comments, ask any questions by using the raise your hand feature. And with that, I will hand things over to the Friends of Dyke-Marsh President, Glenda Booth, to kick things off.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. We're really pleased to have this presentation about bats, probably one of our most underappreciated, underloved mammals or species of wildlife. We have two co-sponsoring organizations, the Friends of Huntley Meadows Park and the Friends of Accotink Creek. So I'd like to call on their representatives to see if you have any quick announcements that you would like to share. So how about Friends of Huntley Meadows Park? I don't know if Ben is on or if Ben sent somebody else. Speak up, Ben. Okay, Friends of Accotink Creek. I believe Beverly has some announcements.
That's me. We do a lot of stuff within the community, and this really coincides with what we're doing with picking up trash, with getting rid of invasive species, with providing habitat. And so I'm really happy to be here tonight and represent that and see what we can do to help things out. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. For the Friends of Dyke-Marsh, we have invasive plant work sessions coming up on November 5th and November 19th, also December 3rd and December 17th. Generally, we're doing these twice a month on Saturdays, and we're starting at 10 a.m. and most of our work is in the native plant area, so hope you'll come out and help us. There's information on our website, and don't be intimidated at all because we target just a few plants and we train you, and they're very easy to identify. So we hope you'll come out and help us with that on those dates, and look at our website for the specifics. So tonight we're going to hear from Deborah Hammer, who is a bat expert. appropriately attired with her bat hat. Um, Deborah is a member of the board of directors of the Friends of Dyke Marsh. And we're very happy to have her. And she lives right on the edge, lucky Deborah, right on the edge of Dyke Marsh. She's also a board member of the Bat Conservation and Rescue of Virginia. And Deborah is a very accomplished teacher and supervisor of teachers who work with children with disabilities. And she's very distinguished in that field. So I know we're going to have a great presentation tonight, and we'll all learn a lot about bats. Okay, thank you, Deborah. Go ahead.
Thank you, Glenda, for that lovely introduction. All right. Let me just make sure I've got it on. Sharing the screen. Can everyone see my screen, Glenda? Carolyn?
Looks good.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, we'll get started then. So a little bit of background. Bats are the only flying mammals, and we know they're mammals because they have fur. Fur or hair is something that all mammals have. They give birth to live babies, and they, which is true for all mammals except for a couple in Australia, echidnas and platypuses, and they have 3 bones in their ear. And of course, they feed their babies milk, just like we do. There are over 1,400 different species of bats, a quarter of all mammal species. So they are very diverse, and they have been here on this planet since the time of the dinosaurs. They live in almost all of Earth's terrestrial habitats, except for a few islands, extreme deserts, and the polar regions. And I am curious if you all can guess why they are not in the polar regions. If you think you know, go ahead and put it in the chat. And I will see if I can see the chat. Freeze is one guess. Cold-blooded. Those are all interesting guesses. They need insects. Those are all excellent guesses. Actually, the reason is, so if you've ever been in the Arctic, there are definitely insects there. They are, they can hibernate if it's cold. They are not cold-blooded. They are warm-blooded. They are mammals just like we are, but it's not too little light, but too much. In the summertime, there is no nighttime, and they are nocturnal. So that is why you will not find them in the polar regions. But thank you, everybody, for playing. Okay, so they mostly eat insects. Almost all bats eat insects, and all of the ones that live in our part of Virginia, or actually all of Virginia, but especially the parts that we're talking about in Northern Virginia, they all eat insects. And about 33% of bats do eat pollen, fruit, or nectar. So they will consume, they will pollinate flowers, they'll consume whole fruits or parts of fruits, and 1% will eat frogs, fish, or other small animals. And out of those 1,400, over 1,400, only 3 drink blood. Their size really varies. We have little teeny tiny bats like the bumblebee bat, which is also known as the hognose bat, and it lives in Thailand. And the largest one is the golden crown flying fox, and it lives in the Philippines. And yes, it is as big as the human next to it. So they really range in size. We do not have any of those great big bats. We'll talk more about that in a second. Their scientific name is Chiroptera. And ptera, you probably know from pterodactyl, means wing. Chiro means hand, like chiropractor. So Chiroptera is hand wings. So they fly with the power of jazz hands. They really fly with their hands, which is kind of different from birds or insects. Those animals have fixed wings that attach to their backs, whereas bats, because they're flying with their hands, they have the same kind of dexterity that we do. If you move your hands around right now, you can see that they can move in all different directions. They have a lot of flexibility. Bats have that same flexibility. They are able to move around in very quick ways, to catch insects, to turn around, to sneak up on them, to change directions, to get away from a predator. And that is why you see bats flying the way that they do. A lot of people used to think that maybe they were blind. That's why they're flying in such a zigzag fashion. No, there is a purpose for it. And the purpose is to sneak up and catch insects. And they can do it. They fly that way because they can. They can fly in a straight line. And you'll often see them do that when they first wake up before they start eating. Just like us, they wake up, they stretch, they have a drink of water, and then they start hunting, usually. And once they start hunting for insects is when you'll see them darting back and forth, and they can even do flips while they're flying. Their acrobatics is quite extraordinary. I do have a video, and let's see. We'll see if we can link to it. I think I have to get out of the share screen though. You can't see that though, can you? Okay, I'm not going to worry about videos for now. Carolyn, could you see my screen just now?
No,
Okay, I am
could
going
all
to
hear it though.
Okay, in that case, I am just going to not worry about the videos for now. And if we have time at the end, we can watch some of those. Sorry, we need to end it.
had high-speed video.
Right. So they have the same number of fingers that we do, and 4 of their fingers have skin between them. They have a membrane, and that helps them fly. That's actually what it is their wing. And their thumbs do not have the membrane around them. Their thumbs are free, and they can move them the same way we can. In fact, if I'm feeding a bat and they're not feeding it quite quickly enough, it can grab me with its thumb and say like, hey, come on, human, get over here and feed me faster. Their knees and their feet are backwards from ours, and that allows them to hang upside down. And that's a great position for them to be in because it allows them to scan for predators. They can easily hang from the side of a rock if they're in a cave, or from a tree if they're outside, and they can start flying immediately. So it's a very convenient position for them to be in. Their membrane isn't just around their fingers, but it's also around their shoulder and down all the way past their bottom and down to their feet. And again, that helps with their ability to fly. And their vision varies between species, but they all can see. Some can see in ultraviolet light, some can see colors, especially the ones who eat fruit or flowers. But the insect eaters who live here in Virginia, in Dyke Marsh, Huntley Meadows, they do not see colors. They do not have cones in their eyes, only rods. However, they do see a lot of detail in black and white. And if they did not have their vision, they would not be able to survive. They do need their vision. Some other things about their anatomy that are a little bit unique. They have a bony spar on their ankle, and that helps to support their tail membrane. All bats do have tails. You don't always see the tails because some bats have a membrane that completely covers the membrane and some do not. And we call those free tails because their tails are not covered by membrane. They have here in this picture on the bottom right, on actually both pictures, you can see their thumbs sticking up. You can see their wrist, and you can see their elbow. So their body structure is very similar to ours, except that their hands are huge in relation to the rest of their body. Their bodies are actually quite tiny, and they have these giant hands. And again, that helps them to fly. Some bats have a nose flap, and that helps them to hear. Some have a tail membrane, as I mentioned before. And all bats have a tragus, a flap of skin at the base of their ear. And those are some things that make them a little unique. Talk for a second about megabats and microbats. So megabats are huge bats. Those are the really big ones. They unfortunately do not live here. They can only be found in Asia, sub-Saharan Africa, Australia, some islands in the Pacific. There are about 170 different species of them, and they mainly rely on smell and sight to find food. Most or actually all of them are classified as either vulnerable or endangered. They are often known as flying foxes, and you can really see why if you're looking at their faces. They do have sort of a fox-like face, and they can echolocate, but only to find predators, not to find to avoid predators, not to find food. Now here, and in the places I just mentioned, and really everywhere where you can find bats, you will find Microchiroptera, or little tiny bats. And these are our little bats. They use echolocation to find their food. And echolocation is essentially sonar. It's an ultrasound frequency, and they make a sound similar to that. They emit it through their mouth and nose, and it sends an echo out into the air, and it bounces off of anything that it comes across. And that could be a tree, it could be a human, it could be a single strand of a spider web. So anything that it encounters, it's going to bounce off of it and return to the bat's ear, where they're going to be able to form a picture in their brain of exactly what they're hearing. And they'll know whether it's a juicy beetle or a not so good stink bug, or whether it's a human and they need to avoid it, or it's an owl and they really need to avoid it. And so forming that picture in their mind enables them to discern exactly what they're flying to and around. And it's really an extra sense. So it's not that they don't use their vision, it's just that they have this extra sense that helps them understand the world around them in pitch dark.
Hey, Deborah, it's Carolyn. Can I ask 2 questions from the chat?
Yes, please.
The first one is from Allison, and she asked, what is the purpose of the thumb in bats?
What is the purpose of the what? I'm sorry.
The thumb.
Oh, what is the purpose of the thumb? They can grab things with it. They can use it to hold on to their children. They can use it to help them climb. I've seen them use it to pull things closer to them, like food. So they use it for the same reasons we do. It just gives them more dexterity.
And the
Good
second question is from Robert, and he asked, how do bats see at night? And does the moon play a factor in that?
So bats see at night because they have more, your eye has 2 kinds of cells in it. It has cones and rods, and cones help us see color, and rods help us see detail and also give us our night vision. And the bats that live around here have more rods in their eyes, so they have better night vision than we do. That between that and their echolocation is how they're able to navigate in the dark. The moon doesn't really so much play a factor. I mean, I'm sure it helps, but it can also hinder them because it enables predators like snakes or raccoons or owls to see them better too. So it's not necessarily a bonus. There's a cost to it. But those are good questions. So I'm going to try and play some echoes for you, and I record these on my phone. I have a little device that plugs right into my phone. It's a very expensive little device, but it's a sonar detector, and I can hear the bats. Normally, I would not be able to do that because their echolocation is at a much higher frequency than human ears can actually hear. So all my device does is translate it into an audible range for human hearing. And since each bat echolocates at a slightly different frequency and a slightly different tempo, we can tell which type of bat is emitting that particular call. So, and in that way, I can figure out what bats I'm listening to. So I'm going to try and play one for you, and hopefully if I hold it close enough to the computer, you'll be able to hear it. One. Were you able to hear that clicking sound? Maybe not.
I don't think it came through, Deborah.
Okay, all right, thank you. Okay, well, I tried. So it sounds like and it gets faster and faster the closer it gets to an insect. Because first they sort of do a general sound out into the sky, and when they discern that there's an insect and it's one they want to eat, they track it and they get closer and closer and closer to it. And the closer they get, it speeds up, it gets faster and louder. And when they actually catch the insect, you can hear it. It sounds like this, like a slurping sound, and we call that a feeding buzz, and it's exactly what it is. They're catching the insect. And then they go off to catch the next one. So that is how they are able to catch insects in the dark. Bats come in a wide variety of colors, hair, fur, other adaptations. They're all unique. So you can see from some of the pictures, they really come in every shape, color, size, style, hairstyle. I mean, there's such a wide variety. We're talking about over 1,400 species, and there's just so many variations depending on whether they've evolved to stand out, usually to the other gender, or whether they're trying to camouflage themselves from a potential predator. So they have a lot of different adaptations. And most bats look the same between the males and the females. In fact, it'd be very hard to figure out which is which just from looking at them. However, there's one that's really distinct, and that's the one that's in the center on the bottom with a really big head. that is a hammer-headed fruit bat. And in that species, only the males have the large head, and they have that huge nose because they make a honking sound. And apparently, females find that extremely attractive. So they only do that when they are searching for a mate. Now, some bats, as mentioned before, have a leaf nose, and that is a specially designed nose to assist them with their echolocation. Other bats have unusual noses so that they can get into a flower and suck the nectar out, like this tube-nosed bat down on the right corner. Looks a little bit like Yoda. And other bats have smushed faces so they can get into fruit and eat the fruit. So the unusual faces that some have, it just depends on what they have evolved to do with those particular adaptations, either having long noses or short noses or flaps on their nose to help with the sonar. Think of the flaps, think of it like a satellite dish or something like that to get the sound back into their ears. So that's really their goal, is anything that channels the sound up into their ears. And you can always tell a bat that is an insect eater too by it, because those are the bats that will have the biggest ears. They are very, very critical to our ecosystem. We really could not survive without bats. And that may sound like an exaggeration, but I promise you that it's not. 80% of the world's fruits are pollinated only by bats. And that includes papaya, guava, mango, durian, a number of tropical fruits and even fruits that humans don't consume, but are necessary for tropical rainforests and important for other animals to eat. Many other plants or that can produce fruit are partially pollinated by bats, like chocolate and coffee and sugar. So some of those are pollinated also by other animals, including ants, bees, and other insects. And bats do contribute to the pollination. Bats also disperse seeds. So many of the larger fruits are eaten by bats, and the fruit seeds then pass through the bats. And as the bats are flying, they disperse the seeds and are already fertilized. And actually some have to pass through a bat in order to germinate. So they coexist. It's a symbiotic relationship, and we need the bats if we want the trees. As far as insects, a single big brown bat can eat 3,000 mosquitoes a night. That's not a misprint, 3,000. So, if we don't want to be overrun with certain types of insects, including mosquitoes, which carry lots of diseases, then we need bats. Farmers need bats to save their crops from beetles, moths, centipedes, and other pests that would otherwise consume their entire crop. And they perform an invaluable service with eating those pests, because then the farmers don't have to put down so many pesticides. They can allow the bats to do it for them. The bats eat well, and we have food to eat. So truly, if you like to eat, then think a bat. Oh, one more thing. On that last slide, if I can go back to it. Well, maybe not. I was just going to point out that agave, which is the cactus that produces tequila, is also pollinated solely by bats. So I have some myths and facts for you. And these, I put these down because these are the ones that I hear most commonly. When people hear that I like bats, I get, the usual script. One of them is, oh, they're flying rodents, they're flying rats. Another, but they're not rodents at all. They are their own classification, as I mentioned before, Chiroptera. And if we're looking at their DNA, the next closest relative are actually canines. You can kind of see that in their little faces. We call them sky puppies or flying puppies because you can see that many of them do have sort of dog-like faces. And there is a reason for that. Another myth that I hear way too often is they'll get tangled in your hair. So that's not true. They will swoop down close to you, and they usually do that because they're saving you from a mosquito bite or some other insect that's close by. So if a mosquito is near you looking for a place on you to bite, it's attracted to you by your smell, including your carbon dioxide. That's how it knows that you are a living creature that might be good to eat for dinner if you're a female. And they'll hang out near your head before they bite you. That's why you hear them buzzing. And if a bat comes near you, it's most likely focused on getting rid of that mosquito. So it is not going to hit you. As I mentioned before, they can tell a single strand of a spider web. They have no interest in coming near you, and they are not going to get in your hair or your head. Another myth I hear a lot is they'll suck your blood. So see above, the mosquitoes are the true vampires. They definitely will suck your blood, but the bats will not. The bats want nothing to do with you. Bats are blind is another one, as blind as a bat. That's a really, really common myth. And I think it most likely comes from the fact that they are, number one, nocturnal, and number two, that they don't fly in a linear fashion the way that most birds do. So people just assume that they don't know where they're going, but they do in fact see quite well. The last one under myths and facts is that they will give you rabies. Now, that is not completely a myth because like all mammals, bats can get rabies, and like some mammals, they can be a vector species, meaning that they can carry it. However, it's unlikely. Although they can carry it, they don't fly around looking for you to bite. That is not their goal in life. Most all the people who have contracted rabies from a bat have been teenage boys. And that is because they picked up a bat off the ground and literally put their hand in its mouth. If you do that, you could get bit. They're scared. They're small animals, you're huge. So my advice to you is don't pick up any animal, not even a cute little bunny rabbit, because they can have rabies too. And if you don't touch a wild animal, it is very unlikely to bite you.
Hey, Deborah, it's Carolyn. I have some questions in the chat. Can
Yes, please
I
ask.
ask them? All right, so I'm just going to start from the order they came in. The first
Okay,
one,
great.
and she asked, can you talk about bats' teeth?
Yes. The bats, so bats have a lot of different types of teeth depending on what they eat. If they are fruit eaters, their teeth are going to be very different from bats that are carnivores or insectivorous. Insectivorous bats do have sharper teeth because they have to bite through an exoskeleton. They are quite sharp. I can tell you from personal experience eh, I care for bats, and when I have cared for bats, I have actually gotten bit a few times because again, I'm dealing with bats that are scared. They're often sick or injured, so they're in pain. And they're going to use the only tool they have to protect themselves, which is their teeth. So it hurts. But different types of bats have different kinds of teeth, just like the difference between all omnivores, vegetarians, and insectivorous animals. It's going to vary.
Right. Another question from Allison. Do bats drink water or do they get their liquids from food? And where do they go when it's cold?
Oh, these are such good questions. Okay. Yes, they drink water. Most bats will seek out water, and in fact, they need a clean water source to live near in order to get water. There are a few exceptions. Those that eat fruit might get enough liquid from the juice from the fruits that they eat. Although even those bats will usually seek out some water. And some of the bats that live in the desert will get their liquid from the flowers, the nectar, or the fruit that they eat because there is no other water source. So those are the exceptions, but most bats have to have a clean water source to survive. As far as where they go when it gets cold, very good question. It depends on the species. Some bats migrate. They go south, or if they're in the southern hemisphere, north for the winter. And many bats hibernate. So all the bats that live around us, all the bats of Dyke Marsh and the surrounding area do hibernate. We did have bats that migrated out of our area to caves to hibernate, but those bats no longer are alive. Sadly, all of them have died. So we should have bats that use caves as hibernacula or a place to hibernate, but we no longer have them in Virginia. So the bats that we have left that have survived use different types of environments to spend the winter in. Our red bats will hang on a tree that maintains its leaves over the winter, like some oak trees, for example, and it will just curl itself and hang by 1 foot from a branch next to some brown leaves, and it will be completely camouflaged as a leaf. And that's how it will spend the winter. Our silver-haired bats prefer to be down on the ground. Another reason to leave leaf litter on the ground, and they also like to be in fallen logs. So if you have a fallen tree or log on your property, they might like to hibernate there. A funny story, we often get calls in when it starts to get cold outside in like November-ish about a bat in someone's house. And it's flying around in the house, and it's almost always a silver-haired bat because they see a wood pile and they just think, oh, fallen logs. And someone has brought that wood pile in to start a fire. The bat woke up in a nice warm house, started flying around. So, so that can happen occasionally. But that's what they prefer. Our hoary bats prefer to, and hoary refers to their color, it looks like frost, and they also curl themselves up into a ball, and they will spend the winter on a pine tree, like a white pine, and they look just like a pine cone. So that's their camouflage for the winter, and ice and snow can form over them, but it doesn't bother them because they can drop their heart rate, they can drop their breathing to once a minute, and they can spend the whole winter there. So Is what again, it depends on the species. Any more questions for now?
We have questions rolling in. Do you want to tackle them now or do you want to finish this presentation?
Let me finish the slides if that's okay, unless there's something particularly relevant. Let me go through the slides and then I'll open it up for chat. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great.
All right. So most species live between 10 and 30 years, although there are some that live as long as 40 years. So they are extremely long living species of animal, especially when you consider how tiny they are. Most little tiny animals do not live that long. Some species of bats mate in the fall, and then the female puts her pregnancy on pause until after hibernation in the spring. Pretty cool trick. As I mentioned, there are over 1,400 bats in the world. About 40 live in North America and about 16 should live in Virginia. Again, some of those are extinct in Virginia at this point. Hibernating little brown bats take only one breath an hour. That's it. They are highly social and they form friendships with each other. It's really kind of an amazing thing. I've seen it. We had I've seen when the bats are in care, they're very social. They need to be with other bats. So we will put them in enclosures together. And you see that they have preferences. Some want to be with these bats, some want to be with others. We had 2 females that came into care that formed a friendship with each other, and they were always together. They're always right beside each other, snuggling and talking. And when it was warm enough, we put them in our flight cage to practice flying. And a flight cage is just a big, like a gazebo, screened in gazebo, so they can practice flying in a safe environment. And they have to pass a flight test before we send them out into the world, which is flying for a certain number of minutes without stopping. And one of the pair, she passed her flight test before her friend. So we released her. And instead of flying away immediately, which is what every other bat does, she went around to the outside of the flight cage and attached herself right next to her friend on opposite sides of the mesh on the screen. And the 2 of them stayed that way until her friend passed her flight test, and then they both flew off together. So another friendship story has to do with vampires. Vampire bats may not be able to feed every night. So they will regurgitate some blood, which is their meal, to a friend's mouth. So they will feed each other in their time if they need it. So again, true friends, only true friends will regurgitate blood into your mouth. They are very intelligent, very intelligent. I'll give you an intelligent story. This one comes from Merlin Tuttle, who is the guru of the bat world. And I got to meet him a few years ago for the first time, and we were talking, and he told me this story where he was in Panama taking photos of a frog eating bat for National Geographic. He caught 5 bats, and it took him a while, and he caught them in the rainforest in mist nets, and then he brought them to his motel room, which he had set up for his photo shoot. And with the black background and the lighting, and he had lots of frogs, and he took photos of them for a while. He got his photos for National Geographic and eating frogs. And then when the frogs were gone, he put them back in the carrier, put them in his car, and drove them back to the rainforest, 3-hour drive. So he drove them back to the rainforest, released them where he found them, And then he got back in his car and drove back to the motel. When he got to the motel, all 5 bats were outside the door waiting for him. So for them, it's like free food, but they hadn't flown there. They had been in a car, and yet they knew exactly, precisely where to go outside the door of his room. So that just is one example of their intelligence. I want to talk a little bit about COVID. It's not so much in the news now, but this was certainly an issue a year or two ago. People were always asking me, can you get COVID from bats? And the answer is no. It's only spread from human to human, although humans can spread COVID to other animals, as we know from many zoos, especially large cats have gotten it, and apparently deer have gotten it. So it is a zoonotic disease and it can spread, but it's not something you need to worry about getting from a bat. There is a theory that it may have been spread from a sick bat in a wild animal market where all the animals are sick, malnourished, and trafficked from other countries and then held in really unsanitary conditions, which is the perfect breeding ground for any disease to jump species. And whether it was from a bat or another animal, we may never know, but that is a way that zoonotic diseases in general can spread. That's how most flus come. You hear the term swine flu or bird flu. That's because the animals are like chickens, for example, are kept in unsanitary conditions, and that can be a breeding ground for a zoonotic disease to jump species from that animal to humans. And we know there's lots of scientific evidence that says if you keep animals healthy in humane conditions, if you slaughter them in humane, clean, sanitary conditions, then zoonotic diseases are much less likely to occur. And also, if you do choose to eat animals, then preparing them in such a way that kills diseases, cooking them thoroughly, in other words. Okay, now let's talk about vampire bats. So when I work with kids, and I don't know if we have any kids on the call tonight, but kids always want to know about vampires. And yes, they have a bad reputation, but I want to try and combat that a little bit. So yes, they do drink blood. They mainly get it from cows. They are the only species of bats on the planet that is actually increasing in numbers. And unfortunately, the reason for that is because we keep chopping down the rainforest so that we can graze more cows in the land where the rainforest was. But they are easy prey for vampire bats because they just kind of stand there all night and the bats can land on them and suck their blood. So they don't suck it. And I shouldn't have said that, because what they really do is they make a little cut with their very, very sharp front teeth, and they lap it. And they lap up just a little bit because they're little animals. And then they go off and feed their babies if they're female. The babies drink milk. They do not drink blood until they're older. And as I mentioned before, they'll share with a friend. Now, their saliva is kind of amazing. It has a lot of different chemicals in it. And one is an anticoagulant to cause the blood to flow. And there is already a medication or several medications on the market that have been derived based on vampire bat saliva. So they are saving lives. So if you are on any kind of blood clot or anti-blood clot medication, then think of vampire bat. So now let's get into our local bats. So we have about 9 species that are here in Northern Virginia or migrate through our area. And we divide those into 2 categories: our tree bats, and those are the ones that hibernate in trees or leaf litter, and our cave bats that should hibernate in caves. Of course, they don't live in caves in the summertime. They come here, and for the most part, they live in trees during the summer. They will often form communes, especially for breeding and for taking care of babies. So the females tend to stay with other females, usually of the same species, but there may be an area where there are multiple species. That's possible too. The babies, depending on the species, stay with their moms for about 4 months. They're not nursing that entire time, but for a lot of it. And when they're first born, they are nursing just constantly. Every time the mom is not out hunting, they are drinking milk and getting bigger. They're born blind. They're born without any fur. So all our local bats are pretty helpless, and they really rely on their moms. The most common species of bat that we used to have were little brown bats. They were everywhere. We had, I mean, that was our ubiquitous species here, with little brown bats. Unfortunately, white nose syndrome has decimated that species, and we almost never see little brown bats anymore. Little brown bats did hibernate in caves where white nose syndrome is taken over. So now our most common species of bat are our big brown bats. And it's a little bit of a misnomer because they weigh only about half of an ounce. But the little tiny bat can have a wingspan of up to a foot. So their hands are huge. And so when you're seeing them flying in the sky, you're seeing their hands. Their bodies are pretty little. Oh, here are some pictures up close. We have our little brown bat on the left, the big brown bat here on the right. And these are our tricolored bats down at the bottom. They are our tiniest species. They are also a cave hibernating bat. So unfortunately, we really don't see tricolors very often anymore either. Very, very rarely. Some of the other bats we have are our northern long-eared bats. A little less common. I haven't seen or heard them in Dyke Marsh or Huntley Meadows, 2 places where I listen to bats a lot, very frequently. Hoary bats are migrating through right now. We hear and see them mostly in the fall and the spring. And our red bats are here all year round. In fact, you might even see a red bat on a mild winter day. They will wake up, and they're likely to see, if you see a bat in the daytime, it's probably a red bat. For whatever reason, they get really thirsty, and I see them getting up in the day, just like humans might get up in the middle of the night. I see them getting up in the middle of the day for a drink of water sometimes. These bats are much less common. Gray bats are critically endangered. So even though this is habitat for them, we seldom get a gray bat. Silver-haired bats are very common. We do have those. And we have evening bats as well. Now, we have 2 bats that are kind of really not supposed to be here. It's not a bad thing, but they are here. They have migrated north. So our Seminole bats, as the name suggests, they should be sort of in Seminole area, Florida, Georgia, really not much further north than that. I heard recently that they had been spotted in Ohio, so they are definitely branching out. And our Brazilian freetails, again, unheard of a few years ago, are now in Virginia. In fact, quite well established. We have a number of them in Dyke Marsh. So they are here. If you read books about them, you will read that they don't hibernate. And this appears to be untrue. Just like big brown bats, little brown bats, if they live in Florida, they're not going to hibernate because they don't need to. If they're here, they will. And it appears that both the Brazilian freetail and the Seminoles have figured out hibernating because they are thriving, their numbers are growing. And I have recorded them on mild winter days, which shows that they definitely are not migrating. They are staying put through the winter. So they have figured out hibernating. When we talk about habitat, an ideal habitat would be something like Dyke Marsh or Huntley Meadows or another area or park around Accotink, around our area, that with marshlands, trees, combination of living and dead trees. Dead trees are perfect, or dying trees are really good habitat because the woodpeckers will make holes and the bats will live in those holes. So that's a perfect place for them to live. An adequate substitution can be a park. It could be a barn. Again, as long as there's clean water and a place to live. But, here we have pictures of Roslyn and Centerville. No trees, lots of tall buildings, lots of light pollution, not a good habitat for bats. So they have really lost a lot of habitat. And there's a lot of pollution, light pollution, sound pollution, in addition to just dirty skies, dirty water, that is a serious threat to bats. And our bats are struggling. As I mentioned, the loss of habitat is a huge one. Not having the trees is a big one. And of course, the trees can be cut down for construction, to build new houses, or to build a new grocery store. But a lot of people will take down dead or dying trees in their yards too. And for good reason. You don't want a dead tree to fall on your house or your car or your neighbor's car. But when we take down all those dying trees, then the bats and other animals don't have a place to live. So if we can leave the dying trees up as much as possible, it does help our animals, including bats. There are pesticides which are killing bats, herbicides that people put on their lawns. If you have sprayed insects, then you're spraying other animals too. You're killing the animals that eat the insects, and that includes bats. Light pollution, sound pollution, we have lots of helicopters and planes and leaf blowers and all kinds of other things that make it difficult for bats to echolocate and to hear the echoes. And if they can't hear where the food is, then they can't hunt. They can't survive, and they'll die of malnutrition. They sometimes die from collisions, could be with a vehicle. Again, they can see quite well when they're echolocating, but they don't echolocate unless they're eating. So if they are migrating or just flying, they're not using their echolocation. And those are times where they can have collisions with vehicles, power lines, and wind turbines. Wind turbines is a big one, and they get sucked into those turbines too. Disturbances from humans, especially during hibernation. If humans disturb them during their hibernation and they wake up too many times, they can use up all their fat resources. For example, people going into caves to explore during the wintertime, they may think, oh, I woke up the bats and they were flying around. Wasn't that fun? I've had people tell me this, but it's killing the bats, because if that happens to them more than once, they can use up their fat reserves, or if they fly out into the cold to get away from what they see as a predator, they can freeze to death. Their predators include things like snakes and owls in the wild, but pet cats are a huge, huge threat to bats. If you have, and feral cats as well. But cats that are let out will often attack bats during the daytime because the bats are just sleeping. They can't protect themselves. And if they're just hanging on a tree, which is what they're often do, then a cat can easily catch them. And finally, white nose syndrome. So white nose syndrome is it's a disease caused from a non-native fungus, Pseudogymonicus destructans. And this fungus first showed up in the United States in 2007. It hasn't been that long. It attacks bats who are hibernating in caves. The bats go to the caves for the winter. They huddle together, sometimes really deep in a cave, and they go to sleep. And the fungus grows over them during the wintertime while the bats are sleeping. The fungus spreads. And if the fungus, when it gets over their faces, it causes this distinctive white patch, which is why it's called white nose syndrome. And the bats wake up trying to clean it off because they're actually really clean animals. And it bothers them and it wakes them up, and they keep waking up and trying to groom it off. And sometimes they'll fly out of the cave and they'll freeze to death, or they'll use up all their fat reserves and die. And humans are the vector. So the fungus was thought to, it's native to the Alps and some other mountain chains, but mainly the Alps. And it was thought to have come here on the crevices of hiking boots from people who visited caves there. And we know now that it can live years and years and years. In fact, they don't even know how long, because shoes they've been tracking for more than 10 years that have fungal spores on them, the fungal spores are still alive. So if you go hiking in a cave, you put your boots away, and then you fly somewhere else and put those same boots on and then go into the cave, or it doesn't have to be boots, it could be shoe, any kind of shoe. The fungal spores are there. Sneakers, you can spread those spores into the next cave. And just a few spores can grow very quickly and can spread through the cave. So that's how the fungus spreads. And it has really, really spread. And it continues to spread, unfortunately, even though we don't have any bats left. It's been, I say the mortality rate exceeds 90%. It's basically 100% in most caves on the East Coast. So the bats are all dead. And even if you go into a cave that no longer has bats in it, you think, well, the bats are gone now, I don't have to worry anymore. But if you have those fungal spores on your shoes and you go visit a cave in New Mexico or California or Saskatchewan, you can spread the fungal spores there. So that's a problem. And that's what's continuing to happen as people go into caves, they get the spores on their shoes, they don't clean them off. It can be cleaned off with disinfectant, especially bleach, and then they spread it. And it's a huge problem. So not having the bats, of course, is devastating, just simply because we don't have the bats. But it's also devastating because, as I mentioned before, we need bats. If we like to eat, which I assume that many of you do, we need bats. So we know that the loss in agricultural products rates in the billions. Pennsylvania has been really particularly hurt from the loss of their bats, and they've lost a lot of their produce, and they're having to use a lot more pesticides. Most farmers are now, because they don't have the bats anymore. So what can you do? You can preserve habitat, especially wetlands, which we all here love. woodlands, dead trees. You can put up bat houses. You can reduce the use of pesticides and urge other people to do the same. Keep pet cats indoors. Avoid going to caves. Stay out of the caves unless you absolutely have some pressing reason that you have to be in that cave, such as being a bat biologist doing a survey. Stay out of them. And clean your shoes. Clean your shoes if you have visited a bat. And teach other people about bats to reduce the needless and deliberate deaths from fear and ignorance. Bat Conservation and Rescue of Virginia, we were called Save Lucy until recently. We just recently changed our name. It's an organization I work with and volunteer with, and we teach the public about the importance of bats. We support research and projects that protect bats. And we also provide rehabilitation services to bats that have been injured or orphaned. These are some examples of some bat houses. There's lots of different types. You can, you can get plans to make your own from Bat Conservation International. They have some sites there, or you can buy ones that are pre-made. And I have to leave you with some ridiculously cute baby pictures of bats. So here is a little baby red bat. This is the same bat. So you can see when it was born at the bottom, it was smaller than a quarter. It had no fur. It was pretty helpless and pathetic looking, and we had to feed it every 2 hours around the clock. And then it got some fur. Since it was an orphan, we do with what we do with all our orphans, and we put them on their surrogate parents, which are bat dolls, and wrap the wings around them, and then we put them in an incubator to keep them nice and warm. Here's some other bat pictures. And just to review, I mentioned that they're superheroes, so they are our only flying mammal. They save us from mosquito bites. They give us fruit and tequila. They protect our produce, and they can see in the dark. So I think that qualifies them as superheroes. I'm going to stop sharing, and we can take some more questions.
All right. So I'm just going to start from where we left off. So John said, I understand there's been a notable decline in insect populations. Are there any indications that this is affecting bat populations?
It's hard to know because our bat populations have crashed so much. So I'm not honestly sure whether there's a correlation between the loss of the insects and how that has affected our bat population. Our bat populations have declined dramatically, but I'm not sure that we know whether that's in part because of the loss of the insects, or if it's just all the other factors I mentioned. And there's so many factors, it's almost hard to tease them all out.
Next question from Samantha. Since bats eat so many mosquitoes, do they contract any of the diseases that mosquitoes carry?
Oh, that's a really good question. Not that we know of. So bats have a really interesting immune system. Our temperature is 98 degrees. Theirs is much higher. They are pretty much continuously running a fever, and that helps them. That helps fight off various illnesses. I mean, that's what fevers do, is they fight diseases. So because that is their natural temperature, it's thought that that's why they have some degree of immunity against diseases like malaria and Zika and West Nile virus. But they do succumb to others. So yeah, that is most likely the reason why they are not as susceptible to those diseases.
Well, that answered Holly's later question on, do the higher body temps fight off some infections? So
Yes.
You did touch on white nose syndrome, but Mary had a question on whether or not there were any cures to that.
We can, I mean, There's not. The problem is that the bats usually hibernate in crevices in the caves that we can't get to until it's too late, and we find them and they're dead. So there's no way to treat them. We have treated individual bats with antifungal treatments, and those can be successful, but only in the short term in my experience. What has happened to the bats that we had back in the days when we still had bats in Virginia that were getting white nose syndrome was that we would treat them, and then they would be healthy as long as we gave them the antifungal drugs. And then within a year, they were developing other organ problems, essentially autoimmune issues, and dying from that. And it's really kind of interesting because I am not an epidemiologist or a doctor, but other people have suggested that it's similar to what people with long COVID are going through, that they no longer have the COVID infection, but their immune system is so ramped up that they're suffering from the effects of that. And that's really what autoimmune issues are too. Multiple sclerosis, for example, derives from an infection of Epstein-Barr syndrome, and your immune system goes into overdrive and doesn't stop. And that seems to be what was happening to the bats who did clear the initial fungal infections. So sadly, there is no cure.
The next two questions I'll read together. One is from Bob and the other is from Dorothy. Will bats drink from swimming pools or bird baths?
Yeah, they will. They don't understand the concept of chlorine, so they will drink from swimming pools. I've seen them do it. Bird baths, sure. I mean, they would prefer a clean open water source. They drink from the canal behind River Towers, where I live, all the time. But they'll look for any water source that they can find.
Another question from Allison. The evening and the silver bat pictures looked almost identical. How can you tell them apart? And what is your favorite bat, Deborah?
Oh gosh, my favorite. Evening bats have really different ears than the silvers. The silvers to me look like have little bulldog faces. They do. The pictures might not have captured the details, but they do look different. Some bats are harder to discern, but you kind of get used to it, if you work with them enough. You look for little nuances of how they look different, the size of their ears or the shape of their nose, or whether they have a unibrow like the freetails do. So there's differences across all species. My favorite, oh my goodness. I do love hoary bats. I think they're really beautiful. I think locally that's my favorite, probably, but don't tell the others I said that.
You touched on bat boxes. There was a question from Kathy about your thoughts on putting up bat boxes. So I would.
Bat boxes seem to work best when you already have a colony or population of bats and it needs to be relocated for whatever reason. Usually because they have chosen to live on, say, your attic. And I've heard that many people don't like them living in their attics. I'm not really sure why, but I'm kidding, because I do understand. So if you have to exclude them from your house and you want them to go nearby, but not actually cohabitate with you, then a bat box is a great choice. if you have them in a tree and you need to cut that tree down because you don't want it to fall on your car, then having bat boxes for them to go to live in. And also, if you can, cutting the tree down after breeding season, in the fall or winter, is another option. So if you are just trying to attract bats to your house, it's going to be a little harder because the bats don't have the Airbnb app. So it's hard for them to know who has a bat house and who doesn't. So it might be hard for them to locate your bat house, but you can always try.
And Kathy also asked if you had any, or if you knew any place to get a kit or instruction for putting up a bat house.
Yes, Bat Conservation International has bat house plans on their website. I recommend those. And if you want to buy a pre-made bat house, I recommend going to Bat Goods, BATGOODS, Bat Goods. It is a wonderful bat shop, and they give all of their profit to various nonprofits that help bats, like BCI and Virginia Bat Conservation and Rescue and other bat rescue and education sites around the world. So, and they have a variety of bat goods, including sonar detectors, jewelry, and bat houses.
And your Airbnb joke was appreciated. So, okay, next
It's actually a
question.
bat B&B, but yes, thank you.
So next from Philip, can you discuss light pollution effects on bats versus common observations of bats feeding on insects around streetlights?
Yeah. So feeding around streetlights, I mean, that's where you will see them there. And the reason you'll see them there is because there is light and you can see them. It's much harder to see bats in darker places, but the bats are probably just as, if not more prevalent. It's just that you do see them around the streetlights, and sometimes certain types of insects are drawn to the streetlights, especially moths, and red bats are moth specialists. So you'll often see red bats around streetlights. That is a little different from the type of light pollution I'm talking about, where you have a 30-story office building that keeps all the lights on all night long. And there's so much light. I mean, just so much light generated. And if you look up in the night sky, you can't even see that it's night hardly in some places. Or parking lots or stadiums that have giant lights that just, you can't even see that it's night. Then it is hard for the bats because they're vulnerable to predators. If they do try and hunt, and they can easily get eaten, or it just makes it harder for them to find their prey. So some bats do try and hunt in those circumstances, but you won't see the quantity of bats in a very lit city or suburb, or a place that's not a forest. And when I go out listening to bats, I mean, the numbers, I can just tell just from listening to them, the data is there. We can do acoustic monitoring, and the number of bats that's in darker forests or marshes versus the shopping center that's a couple miles away, it's pretty obvious where the bats prefer to be.
Question from Allison on sound pollution. It's noisy in the day, so how do bats block out that noise and ruckus when sleeping?
I have no idea. I couldn't do it. But some have figured out how to do that. They do a better job than you'd imagine. In some bats, especially the freetails, have learned to live under bridges with trucks and cars driving right over them. So it's not even just the sound, but the vibration, but they have figured it out because it's to them, it's a safe crevice they can crawl into to avoid raccoons, and snakes and other predators. So they've done that cost benefit analysis and have somehow adapted to sleeping in a very noisy world. They don't like thunder though. They really don't. I've seen that if it's thundering outside, they know what that is and they know to stay put. That is not a good time to go out and hunt, and they don't want anything to do with it.
So when you were talking about white noise syndrome, Kay asked, what about Mammoth Cave in Kentucky? How are the bats there?
They have been affected. They have not been completely decimated the way that they have here. I know that they do have protocols in place for people to clean their shoes. So they are doing their best to protect them. Not all caverns and caves are doing that. Most privately owned ones are not following those protocols, unfortunately, but Mammoth Caves is. So for now, most of their bats have survived it, and hopefully that will continue to be the case in the future.
And the last question in the chat is from Holly. Is there any community science project for tracking bats?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. Yes. So the app that the device that I use is by a company called, it's called an Echometer, and it's by Wildlife Acoustics. And you can share your results if you choose to get that particular brand or other brands. There are other brands too, but you can share your results with other citizen scientists. You can use apps like iNaturalist to share your results, and professional chiropterologists are using that data to see what bats are out there. So if you are interested in something like that, I do encourage you to get a sonar detector, a bat detector, especially one that can, if you don't have to get a more sophisticated one. If you want to get one that just is for your own information so you can hear them, that's great. If you want to invest as a group project in a more sophisticated one like the Echometer and participate in a science project, that would be even better. And they do give out grants and scholarships to organizations like scout groups or nature centers for exactly that purpose, so that groups can participate in projects like that.
So that was all the questions from the chat. I guess if anybody wants to come off mic and ask any questions, please feel free. Otherwise, a lot of appreciation and thanks for the great presentation in the chat from everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
So are there any more questions? I guess not. Well, thank you, Deborah. Thank you, Carolyn.
Pleasure.
It was a great presentation, and I know we all learned a ton. And thank you, Barbara Bacon. And we're gonna all go out and save our bats. Thank you, everybody, for participating. In terms of our events, we'll be working on our calendar for next year soon, so stay tuned for that. And good night.
Night.
Good night.